Imagine, a podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Hello again, I'm Martin Ballard and this is episode 22 of this podcast series, with all of the Imagine pantomimes now closed, bringing to an end a very challenging Christmas 2021 season.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
So first of all, a Happy New Year to you, and a reminder that if you have missed any of the previous episodes with directors, choreographers and stars of Imagine Theatre shows, you can of course catch up with them at any time, because they are still available to download. And don't forget to subscribe to this series so that you don't miss out on any episodes in the future. Now, you may remember in episode 21, I was joined by Imagine's associate producer and head of celebrity casting, Laura Taylor, who talked about the challenges that may lie ahead in difficult times with COVID-19 cases on the increase again, and the precautions and protocols introduced by Imagine to help avoid or cope with any issues. In this episode, we'll be discussing just how challenging the season really was, with shows up and down the country closing, the West End seeing unprecedented closures, cast and crew members having to self-isolate, and of course the knock-on effect all of these issues had. Laura Taylor joins me again, along with Imagine's managing director Steve Bowden and artistic director Eric Potts, who saw firsthand the effects of COVID-19 when, as director and Dame, his own show in Llandudno had to close early, and then from Boxing Day he slipped into the show in Leicester to cover Dame there. Let's start with you, Steve, though, first of all, because for those people who don't know Imagine, just set the scene for us. How many shows you had this year? Because it was clear, wasn't it, that after a year without Panto, things were going to be very different.
Oh goodness, hi Martin. Yes, so we carried over the planning of pantomimes back from 2019. The 2019 Panto season obviously happened, and we had a lot of titles lined up for 2020. So we found ourselves in a position of having 16 pantomimes lined up to go at the start of 2020. And then during the course of the pandemic, and realising that we weren't going to be able to deliver pantomime in 2020, we picked up a couple of more additional contracts throughout the year. So we actually started 2021 with 18 pantomimes and Christmas shows lined up, the busiest season we've ever had. But of course, we were staring at a kind of unknown year, because at the start of last year, nobody was really sure how on earth we were going to get to the end of the year and whether indeed we would get those pantomimes on. And I remember literally this time last year sitting there when we were back into a very, very deep lockdown thinking, goodness, we've just gone through no pantomime. I'm not sure we're going to get any more pantomimes on in 2021. Of course, fast forward to the summer when it became apparent that the pandemic was easing off, and very quickly the positivity in our sector returned, theatres reopened, and conversations picked up a pace. But we were left with potentially 6 months of time to put on the largest number of productions we've ever staged. Our team just dropped everything and supported Sarah and I and the full company. And we delivered 18 productions. What a journey it was, and certainly what a journey it turned out to be over the Christmas period. But we got all 18 of those shows onto the stage.
And that doesn't take into account the shows with other producers that you were facilitating with set and costume hire, does it?
Goodness, yes, that was also running alongside, because we'd obviously got bookings for set hires in 2019. 2020 came along, and unfortunately the pandemic claimed a couple of theatre set providers, and all of a sudden our bookings for set hires increased as well. So we ended up with more scenic hires and costume hires and special effect hires than we've ever had before as well. It really did put an enormous pressure on the operation, but like most businesses, we had to survive, the industry had to survive, and we had to do whatever it took to deliver on all those contracts.
Well, we talked about it being very different. Laura, just explain what was different to usual.
Martin, I think the easiest question would be what was the same? There was a hell of a lot that was different. In normal times, pantomime is an 18-month process that is more or less the same every year. And the pandemic just threw that process up into the air. So for a start, the theatres themselves, the majority of them were completely closed until July, when we were told that the theatres could open to full capacity again. Some of the theatres didn't open until September. So from a marketing and audience development point of view, it was completely different. They hadn't had anybody through the doors for a year. They didn't publish their brochures like they normally would, advertising all the shows coming up, because their programming kept changing and being cancelled, and as I say, the venues weren't even open. The whole process of pre-publicising the shows was different. We normally book some of our advertising space way back in February. None of us wanted to do that because in February we didn't even know if we were going to have a pantomime season. So from that point of view, it was extremely different. And then getting the shows together themselves, performance side of things, not so much, but the pandemic has caused a massive exodus of people from the industry. You know, highly skilled people in all other areas, stage management, sound, lighting, wardrobe. So to try and find the personnel on the shows was really, really difficult this year, and we'd normally have the majority of that sewn up by September.
And of course, Laura, underscoring all of this was the fact that Imagine Theatre had had no income whatsoever from the previous cancelled Christmas season. So how important was the Culture Recovery Fund?
We were lucky enough to be awarded a couple of rounds of that grant, and I mean, it kept the company alive. Obviously, we're a pantomime production company, that's our bread and butter, and we didn't have a pantomime season last year. But the company was still running. We still, you know, Steve and Sarah still had bills to pay on the building and all the storage of the sets and costumes and keeping the staff. So that kept the company going and put some money in the bank at a time where we hadn't had any income for going on nearly 2 years.
And it's worth pointing out as well, isn't it, that companies like Imagine Theatre will invest in a show well over 12 months before it's staged and will not get any income from it until the end of the show's run. And that's quite a risk, isn't it?
It's a huge risk because, you know, these shows don't just happen overnight. They're not just created in a click of a finger. You know, we have to start the production process really early on in the year. So we have to get scripts written. We have to start creating sets, props, costumes. We need to start marketing it. All of those things come at a cost. So the Cultural Recovery Fund also allowed us to have that investment there ready to create the shows. And it was a huge risk. We just had to hope that we didn't go on national lockdown, and we didn't go on national lockdown, but in some of the areas where we produce in Scotland and Wales, they did bring social distancing back from the 24th of December, so we had to close some of our shows, but we'd already invested in the creation of those shows. Now, if that had happened in England as well, that would have been huge loss.
And Steve, when Nicola Sturgeon and Mark Drakeford made those announcements on Tuesday the 21st of December, everything changed, didn't it?
We'd spent an awful lot of time last year putting contingency planning in place for potentially losing performers or losing maybe one show in one area. There was obviously no government insurance that was affordable or indeed available to us. But I don't think any of us had in our planning that an entire nation would close the doors to its theatre in an unbelievably short amount of time. Certainly the venue managers in Scotland hadn't really got this on the horizon, and as producers and providers of product, we certainly didn't see it coming. The first I sensed of the Omicron variant was whilst I was in rehearsals in Reading, and I think it was the end of our first week, and this word Omicron that none of us had ever heard of suddenly appeared in news articles at the end of the week. And I remember just thinking, the way this is being portrayed is going to give us a bit of a bumpy ride. But it took a few days for the gravity of what was happening to sink in. And then, of course, the announcement on that Tuesday sent us all into a panic and a spiral. And I think what was really hard for us to compute was the fact that there was not an order to close, but the framing of the announcement was such that when you sat down and talked to the theatres and to the box office and looked at the logistics of how, in effect, we were going to have to strip out 1,000-seater venues down to audiences of no more than 200, it became an impossible task for us to do that. It was actually closure by stealth, because pantomimes, as you know, are immensely popular. People book up months in advance. We were carrying bookings over from 2020, and there was just far too many people wanting to see the pantos and not enough capacity on a 200-seat limit.
Well, let's find out from artistic director Eric Potts what it was like, because, of course, Eric, you were actually not just writer, director, but also Dame in Llandudno, one of those shows that had to close. So How was it for you and the rest of the cast there?
We'd been open for, well, certainly well over a week by that point. And obviously, with my artistic director hat on, I was keeping abreast of situations elsewhere. I was aware of various councils in Scotland that were saying, oh, we're not keen on the school parties and everything. All the time you're thinking, how much further will this go? Will this be carried to a national level? We were aware of the daily figures, they were climbing. So we knew that with the capacity that both of the devolved administrations had put on audience numbers, that it was just going to be totally impossible to continue. They were going to be introduced on Boxing Day. So, of course, the decision was taken for us to close on Christmas Eve once we had finished both our performances on Christmas Eve. And we set up a big telly. It was like being back in primary school. They wheeled in the big telly onto stage between shows with Sarah Bowden from head office coming on, along with Laura and Steve, saying, look, sorry, this is happening. There's nothing we can do about it. We are as devastated as you will be in the venue. And yes, there were tears on both sides of the screen because the show had really been settling in very well and been getting great reviews, great public response, audience numbers were climbing. So yeah, we were devastated. Box office were then manically trying to get people that had booked for Beyond, for the Betwixtmas, as it's known, isn't it? Those shows in to fill the auditorium as much as could be before Christmas Eve.
Now, as well as the regular Panto season planning, Laurie, you'd done so much work in terms of the planning for COVID-19 to cover just about every conceivable scenario, and that included daily testing for actors in the rehearsal room, mask wearing and so on, but also you'd set up teams of swing actors who you could parachute in if they were needed.
Before the virus, that age-old saying, the show must go on, and that was normally the ethos for live theatre. If somebody got a bit poorly, they would either just dose themselves up on something and just soldier on, or only be off for a day or two and be back. And with the virus, it's completely different. The minute somebody's got symptoms, they can't soldier on. They have to go and isolate. And they're isolating for, at the time, 10 days. That was reduced near the end of the Panto season. So because we knew that was going to happen, or it was inevitable that it would happen in some shows, we had to think of ways that we could counterbalance that. So for a start, I mean, there's always understudy tracks in the shows anyway, but we made sure there were really, really strong understudy tracks in all of the shows. And as well as that, we created what we called swing teams. So we had 3 teams of people across the country that were basically sat at home and were sent scripts and video footage of all the shows for them to be learning as many roles in as many of the shows as they could, and to be there ready for us to call them up and go, okay, we need a fairy godmother in so-and-so, can you be there tomorrow? And they would, half know the parts before they even turned up. Thank goodness we put those swing teams in place, because my goodness did we have to rely on them. And it was amazing how flexible those people were, and actually how we did manage to rehearse them in the shows so quickly without it affecting the quality of the show. So hats off to all of our swing members. They were incredible.
They were, each and every one of them. The other thing that we didn't see this year was the Imagine team weren't able to spend as much time, or any time at all really, at the venues. So you were doing everything from a remote office or from home. How did you deal with all of that when the issues started to come up? Okay,
I'm not going to lie, Martin. It has been hell on earth. And I'm sure a season that none of us really want to repeat in that sense. So in a normal year before the pandemic, once the shows are open, you always have issues. Of course, it's live theatre and issues always happen. But once the shows are open and the company managers and the casts are in the swing of it, you spend the season going around and viewing the shows that you've created and seeing the casts and stage management teams, and that's what we normally spend our mid-November to mid-January doing. This year was completely different. One, we didn't want to visit the venues because we normally travel on public transport all around the country. We're going into one theatre every day, sometimes 2 theatres in a day, and we thought to ourselves, if we're getting on and off trains, what happens if we pick the virus up and take it into all of these theatres unknowingly and pass it around the casts? So right from the start, we made a conscious decision not to really socialise with the cast. And in the odd theatre that I did turn up in to see dress rehearsals, I didn't go backstage, I didn't speak to anyone, I just stayed front of house. And that's a really, really hard thing for us as the head office team to deal with, because we've worked on these shows all year and these people are our friends, and we've worked with them year after year, and part of the joy of the job is viewing the shows and going to talk to all the people that are working for you over that 6 to 8 weeks. And we couldn't do any of that, but also we just didn't have time to sit in theatres for 2.5 hours at a time watching a show. We were dealing with so many issues and admin stuff, and every single day there was an issue somewhere, normally a COVID case somewhere.
Eric, it was definitely a season of highs and lows though, wasn't it? The highs being the fact that theatre was open again and that performers were walking out on a stage in front of an audience. There was always that sort of unpredictable air about everything and that sort of fear of the unknown. And then, of course, the show closed. Now, you can't get much higher or lower than that, can you?
You're so right. We were so delighted to be opening an entire season, which had always not necessarily been in doubt, but there were always little undercurrents of, is this going to happen? So we had very much from midsummer been planning for the best while almost expecting the worst. And that, as you say, is almost what happened. We opened, the shows were going down a storm, both the one that I was in Wales and across the season. People were thrilled to be able to get back into venues for pantomime, albeit masked and sanitized and the rest of it, but they were there as they hadn't been the year before, and we certainly were experiencing that in Llandudno. People were loving it, the very fact that they were back in the venue and thrilled to be watching pantomime as part of their family festivities again.
Steve, in terms of the season overall, what was the hardest thing for you and the guys in the Imagine Theatre office? Because, of course, all the communication was done on Zoom or telephone. Was it tough not doing things face-to-face?
Absolutely. I think that was the thing that was the hardest when we were actually in the thick of producing and staging and delivering live theatre. You need to be able to talk to people. You need to be able to go and see them. You need to be able to reassure them. You need to be able to encourage them. And to have that taken away was really difficult, not to be able to go and see the cast that you'd employed and to go and talk to them. But the single hardest thing that I think Sarah and I have ever encountered is having to postpone and cancel the run of a show in the middle of it, doing what it's designed and created to do, to entertain people. I think if you're a producer and you have to lose one show, you're unlucky. But we were faced with the enormous task of losing 4 pantomimes on Christmas Eve in Scotland, a further 2 in Wales, and the only way we could communicate the news to our companies was on a Zoom call, which of course we're all used to, but it is just heart-wrenching to have to deliver the news to a company of 20 or 30 performers, technicians, people who have been waiting for so long to get the theatre reopened and get live entertainment back, to break the news to them that they're going to have to forgo the final week or in some cases 2 weeks of the contract was just heartbreaking. Truly the most difficult thing we've ever done, and hopefully the very last time we will ever have to do that.
I have to say that everybody completely understood. All of the cast's crew, everybody involved with those shows was really understanding and sympathetic, weren't they?
Do you know, they really were, and in some ways that made it worse. and that sounds really weird. You knew that this was something that could happen, but I don't think any of us really thought it did. And just to be greeted with such warmth and such affection actually made it really heartbreaking. But we know that throughout this pandemic, tough decisions have to be made. And people were making decisions based on the information and the guidance that they had at that time. And so we all realised that there was no point in getting angry and upset. We just had to toe the line and do what was safe and right for our employees, the audiences. We just had to respond and react appropriately.
We've talked already about the protocols and the procedures that Imagine set in place to be as cautious as possible. Every precaution was taken. How was it for you and your company in the rehearsal room with daily testing and mask wearing and so on?
Well, you kind of get into that regime routine, if you like. The first thing you do when you get up in the morning is shove the swab up your nose and get the lateral flow hopefully reported negative to the company manager. And just sanitizer everywhere. I got myself a lovely flat. They had bottles of sanitizer in every room, so you couldn't go from room to room without cleaning your hands. I remember there was one day where our choreographer in Llandudno had forgotten to do a lateral flow test. Turned up at the venue, and we basically thought, well, actually, no, hang on. We can't actually allow you in until we've seen that negative test, because to do otherwise would just be potentially catastrophic for the show, for the company. If for whatever reason it did prove to be positive and you were mixing with us while we waited for you to do a test. That kind of brought the whole, I suppose, the seriousness of the situation home.
I genuinely believe we put every safety protocol in place that we could have put into place. I think what we've learnt is that it's quite useful having swing teams there. Even for the usual issues that you might get in a panto season, I think that's something that we might look to repeat in future years. But another thing we weirdly learnt was we normally get what we call the panto flu. There's always some kind of stomach bug or virus or something that goes around at Christmas. And weirdly, we didn't have that this year. And the reason we didn't have that is I think that the health and safety protocols and cleaning processes and all of those things that the venues themselves were doing and we put into place, yes, we kept the virus at bay as much as we could, but I think we kept every other virus at bay as well. I think that's something we'll take from it. There are things that you can put in place, even hopefully when the virus is gone, about keeping your casts safe and well as much as you can.
Steve, I've known you for a very, very long time. I've been involved with Imagine Theatre and its previous iterations since the very early days. I've seen this company and the quality of the shows and the number of shows increase and improve year on year. How did it feel personally for you, knowing that after all that hard work, this could all so easily come crashing down?
You become acutely aware of the responsibility that you have to all the staff at head office and the teams of people you have working on the road. And actually, you worry less about the enormity of the thing crashing down around you, and you worry more about the direct impact that will have on the people who you class as your friends and colleagues who have worked with you for many years, and help develop what is, as you rightly say, a very large entity of pantomime production and family shows. I'm always humbled when we get to the end of the year by the feedback that we get. And actually, we always say, if the door closes now, we have gone out on a high. We have delivered enjoyment and great entertainment to tens of thousands of people over the years. And that fate will play its hand. And I think if you're resilient as an individual and as a company, and if you have that ethos that we will make sure that we're strong enough to weather the storms that are thrown at any business, then should the worst thing happen, you know that you have tried and set yourself every possible opportunity to protect. The fortunate thing that we were faced with was a very resilient team of people working for us and a resilient company, because we've run it long enough and we understand enough about the business and the risks that are associated with it to ensure that the company is very strong and can survive these temporary shocks. There obviously comes a point where you wonder how many more shocks the company can sustain, but at the moment we're here to fight another year, and that's the most important thing, and continue providing employment opportunities for the hundreds of people that work with us.
Now, there are even more twists and turns for you, Eric, weren't there? Because you packed away your bra and wig into the boot of your car and headed home for Christmas after the season in Llandudno was cut short. Little did you know that the dame in Leicester, me, injures himself in the dress rehearsal and is replaced by the company manager, who is his understudy. And you then get a call, because of course you're now available, to come to Leicester and take over that role. How was that for you?
It was, what's the best word? Unexpected, but it proved to be great, and I was thrilled to be able to help. I actually got the first call from Laura. I think it was on the 23rd, when I was still in Llandudno and still had 4 shows to go, and basically saying, look, can you get to Leicester for Boxing Day? And I was able to say yes. So I immediately then started looking at the script. They sent me out the various video recordings that had been made of the rehearsal process and of the dress rehearsal. So I sort of started looking at that, but there was then the slight issue with costumes. I believe I have a fractionally larger waistline than you, Mr. Ballard. By about, yeah, I don't know. So I then was instructed to take practically all my costumes from Llandudno in the back of my car home for Christmas, and then of course take them to Leicester. So my car, there was barely room for me to drive in that car with costumes and all the other stuff. You know what it's like, you build up when you're away doing panto. I had a lovely couple of hours with my family on Christmas morning, then sat with Bucks Fizz for an hour or so, and again went over the script on Christmas morning while turkey was being cooked. I had my Christmas lunch, which was a delight, a lovely time with my family, and then drove to Leicester on Christmas night. Got settled in the hotel around the corner from the De Montfort Hall, and again watched the video, and then got into the venue with our company manager, wonderful Ben Milliman, at 9:30 on Boxing Day, and was on stage at 1 o'clock, treading really your role, really, desperately trying to remember what came next. It was the lyrics to Bake It Off that stumbled me, I have to say, for the first couple of shows. So it was one of the strangest Christmases I've had, but one that I was very glad to be able to resolve the situation in Leicester to a certain extent.
It was the weirdest Christmas for me. 31 seasons of panto, I've never missed a single performance until this year, and then I go and miss the entire run. But it was just one of those years, wasn't it? I spent the whole of the rehearsal period, being concerned about what might happen if I get COVID. I've never had COVID. I'm double vaxxed and I've had the booster. My wife works in the NHS and deals with COVID patients. She's never had it. My son had it last Christmas and was at home, and I didn't get it from him. So actually it turned out for me that COVID was the least of my worries, because I tear my calf muscle and I'm out for the entire run. Have you ever experienced a Christmas like this? I bet you've never ever done 2 pantos in one season before, have you?
No, that's a first. Having missed out on one last year, I think I was just making up for lost time by doing 2 this year. Just the most bizarre times, because of course I was doing the show, thrilled to be in Leicester. First time I appeared at the De Montfort Hall with a lovely bunch of people. Gutted, of course, that you weren't there. But then I was going back to my hotel at the end of the day and reading the show reports from our various venues around the country, with positive tests being reported there and all the usual cast changes and understudies going on, and we had taken quite a lot of time arranging our swing teams, our regional swing teams of people who we kept remote until they were needed. And although we did lose a few, obviously we lost our 4 Scottish shows and our 2 Welsh shows because of the devolved administration's regulations on Christmas Eve. To have got through so many of the other shows to the end of their runs, given what had happened during their runs with all sorts of people chopping and changing roles because of COVID, it's amazing that we actually got through to the end.
In Imagine's history, they've never ever had to pull a show. So to have to pull 8 or 9 in one season was just devastating.
And Steve, we've talked about all of the procedures and protocols you put in place. You did everything possible to try and keep the shows open. But in hindsight, if you had to do it again, would you do anything differently?
Do you know what? That's a really good question. We were determined to make sure that we had put in place our own insurance scheme that would enable us to be able to sleep at night knowing that in the event of cast testing positive or potential loss of performances, we were able to resume and restart as quickly and as stress-freely as possible. I think the enormity of the work that we were undertaking was never going to diminish. I think even when you took shows out of the equation, when shows were closing, it actually increased the volume of work that was needed, because there was then a lot of HR issues to deal with. You were concerned about the welfare. So I think potentially we would have benefited from a couple of more staff at head office just to help with the workload. But, the team have just worked relentlessly. We were all dealing with calls throughout every day from the minute the project started in November through to the closure on the 8th of January. We were talking as a team. Even on Christmas Day, the core staff, we were talking because we were still getting positive lateral flow tests sent through and having to make amends to casting all the way through Christmas. We knew it was going to be tough. I don't think there was much else that we could have done. What was important to me and to Sarah was that we had a very open and transparent dialogue with our theatres at all time. They're the partners who work with us, and we wanted to ensure that before we embarked on the season, we were all very clear on the support mechanisms that they had in place as venues and that we had in place as producers to ensure that we could keep the shows going as long as possible. And that, I feel, we delivered on that in an incredibly efficient and positive way.
When you write your autobiography, Eric, this will be at least 3 or 4 chapters, I think, won't it?
Definitely. You will feature heavily, Mr. Ballard. You certainly will.
So what do you take forward from this whole experience now? What have we learned?
We have learned that there is an incredible resilience within our wonderful community. People can adapt and are willing to adapt in the most extreme ways to keep the shows on. You kind of forget actually how much this matters to the people sitting in front of you. So yes, we've got to look forward with positivity, with hope. There is a lot to learn and a lot of positives to be taken from the most frustrating season ever, I think.
People don't want to be put in front of screens and left to just watch movies or talk to their family, friends, and interact with people through a screen. They want to go and experience the magic of live theatre. And we say the magic of live theatre. The reason is because no two performances of any theatrical production are ever the same. The audience bring that new dynamic. And, to be able to do that many times and allow that many people to see a show, not only our shows, but the hundreds of other pantomimes that producers and theatres were staging across Christmas, just demonstrates the strength of theatre and live entertainment in this country and the determination that we have to make sure it endures. And I think it's reignited a lot of people's interest. It's had a huge media coverage, theatre, over the past couple of years. In the pandemic, we have been one of the worst affected sectors in terms of being closed, the direct impact that has on freelancers who make up the vast majority of our workforce. And the public have united behind our cause, and they love live theatre. What was interesting was that I saw generations of families coming out in a way that I haven't seen before in audiences. Pantomime always brings the families together, but there were really big family groups who had clearly missed it and were determined to enjoy themselves this year.
It's easier already. The fact that venues are open, the fact that they've got audiences coming in, and we're already kind of back in the swing of things. Even that will elongate the process and give us more time to create the shows again this year. So that in itself will just make everything easier. And in terms of the virus itself, we're already hearing rumblings about the isolation periods coming down and the testing process is going to be different. So I've just got to hope and pray that by the time we get to this Christmas, things will be a hell of a lot easier.
We tend to wrap ourselves in our little theatrical bubble and remember, perhaps find it harder to remember the bigger picture of what's going around. But then you look at those numbers and you realise just how important the regional pantos are for so many thousands of people. It is part of their festive calendar. And we discovered this year that so many people had missed it last year when the season was abandoned, and just being able to come to the De Montfort Hall or Venue Cymru or the Palace in Kilmarnock, wherever, it was a real thrill and a real highlight. So yes, there were moments of joy within these bizarre and unprecedented times.
We talked about the understanding casts, the venue staff and the venue operators, all very, very supportive. But I have to say, on behalf of all of the people who work for Imagine Theatre, just how grateful we are for the support that Imagine gives to each and every one of us. Imagine Cares was one of the greatest examples of how supportive you are and have been with people who work for you. So thank you so much for that. There are positives to come out of this season. Over one weekend, there were 85 performances alone. Something like 320,000 people saw an Imagine Theatre panto this year. So are you optimistic moving forward?
I am. I'm very optimistic. What we realised and what we saw in theatres, and indeed saw it in London theatres across the summer, was that there is a demand for live entertainment. I think we have taken a lot of ideas about welfare. I think those things that we developed through Imagine Cares, also the testing protocols, the cleaning regimes that we implemented, what we've noticed is that those sort of things will have a long-lasting effect on our sector. We can look after ourselves better. It is possible to adapt schedules that you thought perhaps couldn't be adapted in the past and make life a little easier on everyone involved.
And I think that's a good point to end this episode on. Thank you once again to Steve Bowden, Laura Taylor and Eric Potts. Don't forget to subscribe to the series to catch up with any episodes you've missed, and that way make sure you don't miss any future episodes. But before we finish, on behalf of Imagine Theatre, I'd like to say a big thank you to the whole team and the companies, the cast, the crew and the venue staff in Coventry, Kilmarnock, Leamington Spa, Wolverhampton, Reading, Rotherham, Croydon, Falkirk, Greenock, Porthcawl, Hoxton Hall, Inverness, Halifax, Llandudno and Leicester. Each and every one of you worked tirelessly to keep the shows open as long as possible, and in particular, the many swings, covers and understudies who stepped up to the mark. You are all incredible. Once again, a happy new year to you, and I hope you can join me next time on the next episode of Just Imagine.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.